Have you ever looked in the mirror and seen your mother's eyes looking back at you, but with your father's smile? Or maybe you've wondered how a trait like red hair can just skip a generation completely. For centuries, these were just mysteries. But today, we're going to dive into how one monk with a simple garden full of pea plants cracked the elegant mathematical code that governs how we inherit everything.
Seriously, think about it for a second. Maybe you've got a certain knack for music, but neither of your parents do. Though, come to think of it, your grandpa was amazing. How in the world does that happen? This wasn't just a quirky family question, it was one of the biggest puzzles in science for hundreds of years. That is until a quiet monk started meticulously counting peas.
So let's meet the man himself, Gregor Mendel. Back in the mid-1800s, he decided he was going to solve this puzzle of heredity. And to do it, he knew he needed the perfect subject. His choice? The humble, everyday pea plant. And it was a brilliant move. Why? Well, they grow super fast. They have really obvious traits you can see, like being tall or short, or having different colored flowers. And, most importantly, he could completely control who the parents were.
Yeah, to get results he could trust, Mendel couldn't just leave things up to the bees and the wind. Nope, he had to become a full-on pea plant matchmaker. This diagram here shows you exactly how he did it. He would carefully take pollen from one plant and transfer it to another, making sure he knew the exact mom and dad of every single seed. This absolute, total control was the secret sauce to his whole experiment. Okay, let's break down that process. First, he started with what are called pure breeding plants. Just think of them as genetically pure. A pure breeding tall plant will only ever make more tall plants when it self-pollinates. Simple. Next, he did a delicate little surgery called emasculation, where he removed the pollen-making parts from a flower so it couldn't pollinate itself. And finally, he played the part of the bee, transferring the pollen himself, and then he planted the seeds to see what would grow.
All right, so for his first big experiment, Mendel took one of his pure-breeding tall plants and crossed it with a pure-breeding dwarf plant. Now, what would you expect? Maybe a bunch of medium-sized plants? Or, a mix of some tall and some short? Well, what he actually got was something else entirely, and it was the first huge clue.
And here it is, the first big shocker. When Mendel crossed that pure tall plant with the pure dwarf plant, he didn't get a mix at all. As you can see right here in this F1 generation, every single one of the offspring was tall. The dwarf trait had completely disappeared. It was like it never even existed. This was the moment he knew the old ideas about traits just blending together had to be wrong.
This surprising result led Mendel to a brilliant insight. He figured that for each trait, one version must be dominant over the other. The dominant trait is the one you actually see. It completely masks the other one. And that other hidden trait, he called it recessive. So in this case, it was obvious. Tallness was dominant over dwarfness. But Mendel was a true scientist. He didn't just stop there. He had a strong hunch that the dwarf trait had to have gone somewhere. So what's the next logical step? He took those all-tall plants from the F1 generation and let them self-pollinate. He basically crossed them with each other to create a second generation of pea plants. And this is the million-dollar question, right? If all the parent plants are tall, you'd probably bet that all of their kids would be tall too. I mean, it makes sense. Was that dwarf trait gone for good, or was it just hiding in the shadows, waiting for its moment?
And then, the big reveal. In the second generation, the F2, the lost trait came back. All of a sudden, mixed in with all the tall plants were little dwarf plants. This was absolutely revolutionary. It proved that the dwarf trait wasn't destroyed or blended away. It was just hidden, carried silently by those tall plants from the first generation.
Now here's the part that makes Mendel a genius. He didn't just look, he counted. He counted thousands and thousands of plants, and when he did, he found an unbelievably consistent pattern. For every one dwarf plant that popped up in that F2 generation, there were almost exactly 3 tall plants. This clean, predictable 3-to-1 ratio, this was the key that was about to unlock everything.
Anytime you see a consistent mathematical ratio in nature, it's a huge hint that there's a predictable system at work underneath. Mendel proposed that traits were controlled by these discrete factors that get passed down. Today, we call those factors genes. And to really see how they combine, we can use a really simple but powerful tool called a Punnett square.
Okay, to really get this, we need to learn a few key terms. It's easy, I promise. That factor Mendel talked about, we call that a gene, like the gene for height. The different versions of a gene are called alleles. In our case, we have the allele for tall, which we'll represent with a capital T, and the allele for dwarf, with a lowercase t.
The specific genetic combination an organism has, like TT or TT, is its genotype. The physical trait you can actually see, like tall, is its phenotype. So genotype is the code, phenotype is the result.
So let's put it all together. Our pure-breeding tall parent plant has two identical T alleles, so its genotype is TT. When you have two of the same allele like that, we call it homozygous. The dwarf parent is also homozygous, but its genotype is TT. Now each parent only gives one allele to its offspring, so the tall parent has to pass on a big T and the dwarf parent has to pass on a little t. That means every single one of the F1 offspring has the genotype TT, one of each. And when you have two different alleles, we call that heterozygous.
Now for that second generation, we're crossing two of those heterozygous TT plants. This means each parent has a 50-50 shot of passing on either a big T or a little t. The Punnett square is just a simple grid that helps us visualize all the possible outcomes. We put one parent's possible alleles on top, the others on the side, and just fill in the boxes. And you can see right away we get three possible genotypes: TT, TT, and TT. Look at that! The hidden TT genotype is back in the game.
And this is the magic moment where the model perfectly matches what Mendel saw in his garden. Let's look at the genotypes. The ratio is 1 TT to 2 TTs to 1 TT. But what do they actually look like? Well, the TT is tall, and the two TT plants are also tall because that big T allele is dominant. Only the TT plant is dwarf. So add them up, you get 3 tall plants for every 1 dwarf plant. The model perfectly explains the 3-to-1 ratio. It works. And for all of you who like math, there's an even cleaner way to see this. You can think of the alleles from each parent as a probability. There's a half chance of getting a T and a half chance of getting a little t. When you cross them, you're basically just squaring that probability. And what do you get? 1/4 TT, 2/4, which is 1/2 TT, and 1/4 TT. That is the exact same 1 to 2 to 1 genotypic ratio we got from the Punnett square. It's the same beautiful math, just written as a formula.
Okay, so this brings up a new practical puzzle. A tall plant could have the genotype TT or TT, but they look exactly the same. So how could a farmer or Mendel tell them apart? You can't just look at them. So, Mendel being Mendel, he came up with another simple but totally brilliant experiment to figure it out.
Mendel's clever solution is called a test cross. The logic is just so cool. Let's switch over to flower color for this one. So you have a purple flower, but you don't know if its genotype is W or WW. To find out, you cross it with a white flower. Now here's the key. Since white is a recessive trait, you know for a fact its genotype has to be WW. That WW plant is like a genetic truth serum. The babies from this cross will tell you the purple parent's secret. And here are the only two ways it can play out. Look at the diagram on the left. If your mystery purple parent is homozygous dominant, WW, it can only pass on a big W allele. That means all of its offspring will be WW, and every single one will have purple flowers. But look at the right. If the purple parent is heterozygous, WW, it could pass on either a W or a W. That means about half the offspring will be purple and the other half will be white. So by just looking at the kids' flower colors, you can know the exact genotype of the parent. It's ingenious.
So, through this whole series of incredibly patient and methodical experiments, Mendel wasn't just learning about peas. He was uncovering the fundamental mathematical rules of heredity that apply to almost all life on Earth, including you and me.
And this table right here really sums up those predictable numbers perfectly. You have that initial cross where all the offspring look the same, showing the dominant trait. You have the famous 3-to-1 physical ratio in the second generation, and you have that clean 1-to-1 ratio you see in a test cross. These simple ratios are the bedrock of classical genetics. Ultimately, all of this careful work boils down to two really foundational ideas. First, the law of dominance, which is why the tall trait completely hid the dwarf trait in that first generation. And second, the law of segregation. This is the rule that explains how that hidden dwarf trait could come back. It just means that an organism's two alleles for a trait get separated from each other when reproductive cells are made, so each new baby gets one from each parent. This elegant separation is the mechanism behind everything we've seen today. But of course, life is a lot more complicated than just one trait. Mendel's amazing work on plant height was really just the beginning. So the next big question is, what happens when you try to track two traits at once, like a plant's height and its seed color? Are those traits linked together, or are they passed on totally independently? Well, that is a story for another explainer.